Can't we? Welcome to DeBarra's Spoken Word. It is Wednesday, the 9th of February, 2022. And I am delighted to welcome you all here for Matthew Geden's workshop on titles. Woohoo! Let me tell you a little about Matthew by means of introduction. Matthew Geden grew up in England and has been living in Kinsale since 1990. His poems have appeared in numerous publications, both at home and abroad, including Something Beginning with P, Poets of the Millennium, The Backyards of Heaven, and Swimming to Albania. His most recent publication, Fruit, was published by Sur Vision Books. He was appointed Poet Laureate by Poetry Ireland for Bandon Poetry Town 2021 and commissioned to write a poem for the launch. Matthew Geden is writer in residence with Cork County Council for the last 2 years. He's been instrumental in creating 3 new virtual writing collectives developed to support networking, creative exchange, and collaboration among writers across County Cork. Matthew teaches on the MA Creative Writing course in UCC and in the School of Commerce. A mentor, writer, and tutor, we're privileged and honored to have him here tonight. Matthew is the whole package. So strap in as we are ready to take off into the land of titles and beyond. Take it away, Matthew.
Thanks, Catherine. Great, really fabulous introduction. Thank you. And just before we start, just listening into the conversation there made me realize the importance of a single word in a title, the difference between the Tiger King and the Lion King being one of them. Okay, so this workshop is based around, well, it has 2 titles itself. How Good Is Your Title, which Catherine very kindly gave me, and my own version, which is Untitled, Is This a Title? It doesn't really matter in a way which title you use. In this case, I'll let you choose. But let's think about titles. My own interest, I wouldn't say I'm a title expert, but rather a connoisseur of good titles, perhaps. My own interest, I was trying to think about this, why I like titles. One of them is because whenever you do a creative writing class, if you can't think of anything else to say, you can always say something about the title. So there's one thing. Another thing is that a title, yeah, I think when I was a child, even, I must have had some interest in titles. I was trying to think about this, and the school I was at, they had just banned corporal punishment. So they had to come up with a kind of different way of torturing students. So the way they came up with was this rather bizarre idea of making students write essays with weird titles. So the one title I really remember being given to a fellow student was they had to write an essay on the inside of a ping pong ball. I was always really jealous of that. I really wanted to have to write an essay on the inside of a ping pong ball. For some reason, I loved the idea of a challenge. I thought it was a great title even then. I still think it's a great title now, The Inside of a Ping Pong Ball. Another thing I remember, and I don't know if this was urban myth or really happened, but one student was given the title of their punishment essay, What is a Calculated Risk? And apparently the student wrote, This is, and handed it in. Presumably they passed with flying colours. I don't know how true that is. It sounds more like urban myth. But titles are, of course, so important in our writing. The word title originally meant a placard or an inscription placed upon an object, giving information about it, okay? Giving information about it. So that's the key thing for me when I think of a title, giving information about the poem or the story, you know. So think about that when you're putting in a title. What information are you giving the reader? We'll come back to that. Let's have a look. Again, when I was thinking about this workshop and how other things we might bring into it, I was thinking, okay, we are writers, we are poets, but what about scientists? How do they come up with their weird and wonderful titles? So I Googled this for a little bit and came up with some tips for drafting a good title for a research paper. So we might think about these and think, how applicable are they to us as poets? So the first tip they give is the title needs to be simple and direct. Simple and direct. Well, yes, it doesn't need to be in poetry, but certainly it is something worth considering, simple and direct. It should be interesting and informative. Well, that goes back to giving information about it. Being interesting, well, yeah, but what's interesting to one person isn't necessarily interesting to another. It should be specific, accurate, and functional. Not really in a poem, I don't think. Of course, in a scientific paper, that makes sense. But do we need to be specific? Do we need to be accurate even, or functional? It should be concise, precise, and include the main theme of the paper. Well, again, not necessarily any of those, but I certainly think when we think of a good title for a poem, we should be looking at the theme. What theme are we directing the reader towards? And we don't have to come up with an exact theme. We could come up with something, a word that actually hints at a particular theme. Again, these are all things we can come back to. It should not be, according to the scientists, misleading or misrepresentative. Okay, I don't know about that either. We're writing poetry. Why not be a bit misleading or a bit misrepresentative? It should not be too long or too short or cryptic. Again, we as poets want to sometimes be cryptic. That's part of the strength of poetry, is that sometimes we are drawn back to a title or drawn back to a phrase. We enjoy as readers being challenged, I think. It should avoid whimsical or amusing words. Well, that rules out quite a lot of poetry, I think. And we'll look at some of those particular titles later on. It should avoid abbreviations and unnecessary acronyms or technical jargon. Again, by now, at this point, reading through these tips, by now I'm starting to want to include all these things. I want to break the rules. And that's what we do as writers, I think. We learn the rules and then break them. So these are rules for a scientific paper. I think you get the picture. We're not scientists. This isn't what we do. We don't need to have these rules. We don't necessarily need a checklist of what a title should and shouldn't be. We need to be instinctive. We need to break those rules. So a similar list really for poetry, I don't think really works. Let's think about, okay, so scientists aren't much help. So then I was wondering whether painters might be much help. What about painting and painting titles of paintings? Well, immediately I think about that and I come up with a problem because quite a lot of the titles we know of paintings are actually not the correct title. So for instance, Rembrandt's amazing Night Watch isn't called the Night Watch at all. It's called Militia Company of District 2 under the command of Captain Franz Banach Koch. You can see why people refer to it as the Night Watch. So And a similar example is Vermeer's wonderful painting of Girl with a Pearl Earring. In an early catalogue that was called Portrait in Antique Costume, uncommonly artistic. I don't know if that uncommonly was a comment on Vermeer or the paintings of the time, I'm not sure. But then in later years, it became known as Girl with a Turban. And it's actually only been known as Girl with a Pearl Earring since 1995, strangely enough. So titles in paintings aren't really much help either. If you think about it, how many paintings do you come across that are actually untitled? Quite a lot, in fact. Picasso said, "What good does it do, after all, to impart explanations? A painter has only one language, and by that he means paint." So the reason we have titles quite often in paintings is really for galleries or for dealers or for sales, really. A lot of the time painters really weren't that interested. Not all, of course, but a lot of painters weren't that interested in, they didn't want to necessarily put a frame of reference on the painting. And this is particularly true of abstract art, of course, you know, where the painter wants the viewer to imagine, to see the picture themselves, to create it themselves in a certain way. As Wolfgang Iser spoke in Literary Theory about the reader creating the text. So in painting, quite a lot of painters want the viewer to create the painting. So that's all very well. Scientists have their own way. Painters quite often avoid the subject altogether, but we're writers and we deal in words. So a title, I think, is an opportunity. It's a real chance for the writer to add in something else, something extra into their work. So what I want to do now is look at a poem without a title. And I'd like you to maybe consider as I read it, and I might read it twice if you need, I'd like you to consider what title you might put on this poem, okay? Now, some of you may know the poem, but try and put that to the back of your mind. Try and listen to the words. Try and imagine what title you would give this piece of work, what you think stands out to you. It may be a word in the poem, it may be a theme, a phrase, an idea that strikes you, even an emotion perhaps, okay? So I'll read the poem, and I might, as I say, I'll read it a second time if you need. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. Okay. Would you like me to read it again, or is one reading enough to get that?
Is there a way you can share the poem?
There probably is, Brian, but if I share the poem, I give away the title.
Would you read it again, please, Matthew?
Yeah,
Sorry
I'll read
about
it again. I'll read it again. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they'd eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. Okay. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to maybe think carefully about what kind of title you might put on a poem like this. Okay. Okay, so it's given you a little bit of time to think. Obviously, picking a title is not necessarily something you can do in 2 minutes, but you know, I'm not going to give you 2 days because I've got other things to do. So okay, so did anyone? I can see some titles flashing up on the screen. Actually, some really good ones too. Did anyone get anything they would like to share aloud as a title? Any volunteers? Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, I think so. It's so rich. I think Banquet of Forgiveness might be good.
Oh, that's a lovely phrase. Banquet of Forgiveness. Yeah, Brian?
I said Achilles the healer.
Yeah, I saw that. That's an interesting one. Achilles as a healer, bearing in mind that Achilles was the killer too of Hector. So that's interesting, focusing on the healing side of this. Between Priam and Achilles, Bernadette, yeah. It is very much a moment. For those of you who don't know, I'll just give a little bit of background on the story that this seems to be referring to, or is referring to. It's an episode, obviously, from Homer's Iliad, the Trojan Wars. Comes from book 24. And what happens is in this book, in this section, Hector has been killed by Achilles. Hector is Priam's son, and Priam actually goes to Achilles' tent, crosses into enemy territory to beg for the return of his son's body. So it's a very moving moment in the story, and here we have it in the form of a sonnet. Does anyone know this poem? I can't see everyone actually, so if I'm ignoring you waving, it's because I haven't got everybody's face on the screen, so apologies for that. But I'm just wondering if anyone actually knows where this poem is taken from.
It's Michael Longley.
Yes. Okay, Anton. Yeah, exactly.
And it's called
Uh,
Ceasefire.
okay. You've just stolen my thunder.
Sorry.
But no worries. Yeah. Okay. So what I was about to say is that the poem appears in many ways, the poem appears to be a poem about the Trojan Wars, simple as that. And when you read it without the title. But as Anton has just said, there is actually a title. Often when I do a similar workshop to this, I'll tell the students, here's a poem with no title. I want you to give it a title. And then I'll tell them, actually, I was lying. It does have a title. And nobody will have guessed the title, of course. The title is, as Anton says, Ceasefire. Now, immediately that word, ceasefire, gives the poem a completely different resonance. If the poem was called Forgiveness, that would be one thing, but this poem is called Ceasefire, and it was written in the 1990s, and it was written by a Belfast poet. It was written in Northern Ireland at a time when there were rumours of an IRA ceasefire. And so suddenly the poem is lifted into a different area. We thought we were reading a poem about the Trojan Wars, and of course on one level we are, but suddenly when we're given this one word title, and that's all it takes, one single word, ceasefire, takes the poem into a completely new sphere. And that is the magic of a title. That's what a title can do. It can suddenly take a poem onto a new level. It can bring in a completely different layer that wasn't there in the original. You won't see anything about the IRA or anything else in the poem. All you'll see is that title. And that's so subtle, but so well done. Longley wrote that at a time when there were, as I say, rumors of a ceasefire back in 1994. And he wrote it, as he says, as his small contribution to the peace process. He wrote it in the hope that it would come true, and he sent it off to the Irish Times, and actually they published it just a couple of days after the ceasefire was announced. And I remember it so clearly because they didn't just publish it in the back pages or in the weekend section, they published it on the front page, ceasefire. And it was, for me, it was an amazing moment of the power of poetry. Here we were with a major event, one of the biggest events in these islands in the last 50 years. And it was commemorated by a poem, and a really fine poem as well, a poem called Ceasefire, this poem. And I just thought that was just so wonderful to have this poem on the front page of a newspaper, and it said so much more to me than any of the other newspaper articles could say about the process. It's such a beautiful, tender moment about forgiveness and what has to be done, to achieve a ceasefire and for a ceasefire to work. So, as I say, it's a poem that I come back to a lot, and it's a poem that really works in the terms of how useful a title can be, and how a title can really change completely the meaning of a poem. Okay, so I'm going to give you a prompt now on that basis, and I'm not going to give you a title. I'm going to give you a first line. Okay, and I want you to continue the first line. It's the first line of a poem, but you don't have to continue it as a poem. You can just continue it as a kind of an idea, a sketch, or even a short story if you like. So the first line is, and you've only got 5 minutes again. This workshop isn't going to go on too long, so I'm keeping these little exercises short. So the first line is, I am silver and exact. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes to see if you can work something from that. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. So you've got a voice there to work with. I'll just give you 1 more minute there. Okay. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Anyone get anything worth reading out? And Anton, I'm wary of coming to you in case you steal my thunder again. Fortunately, you're on mute, so
Matthew, will I drive on?
I won't steal your thunder, Matthew.
thank you.
But I have a little thing. Will I read it?
Yeah, do. Yeah, do.
I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. My fish scales are tuned to the river currents. I turn with a flick in my tail. Balanced on my fins, I am all muscle and teeth. And when I rise, the water streams in my wake, and I make a wonder of sunlight.
The wonderful, lovely piece of writing, Anton. Very, immediately takes me to Elizabeth Bishop's lovely poem on the
Yes.
fish. Thank you. Nick, you wanted to
Yeah, go on. What the heck? I'll throw something in. This is called Millings, and I'll explain why afterwards. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. My value cast upon my face, forever set until replaced by coinage of a different mint. My value melted, unforgiven, cast anew.
Very good, Mick. That obviously resonated with you. Was there's a particular reason for that?
I am silver. I thought of coinage. So millings are the very fine indents that are around the edge of the coin.
Okay, that's a word I didn't know actually, Nick. That's good. Okay, so this poem is actually, this line is actually from a poem by Sylvia Plath. It's a poem called Mirror. So therefore, suddenly you get the way into the poem. It's quite similar in a way to the Michael Longley poem, in that if you read it without the title, you might not quite understand what the poem is referring to. But then that title suddenly focuses the reader, gives the reader a way in to the poem. And it's a great line. I mean, I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. And as we've just seen from Nick and Anton there, that it can lead in many different ways. So yeah, I mean, maybe try and develop that piece that you've just started, and think about a title for it. Think about how you would bring in a title that maybe really either sharpens the theme of the poem, or even I mean, Nick already had one there, or even maybe distorts it sometimes. That can work too. I'm just actually, I went sorry, I was just going to say something else, but there's a few other things I want to get through, and I don't want to, as I say, keep you too long on this. Okay, so I thought we might look at some titles of famous books, because there are a number of famous books whose original titles was nowhere near as strong as their final title. And I would suggest that a title does make a big difference. And I spent years as a bookseller, and I think a title does draw people. A title should be memorable. How can you order a book if you can't remember a title? Well, believe me, it happens every day if you work in a bookshop. You have to be a kind of minor detective to be a bookseller. If you're forever getting people coming in with jumbled up titles, jumbled up information, titles that are completely wrong. So yeah, a title is important. A title should be memorable. There was a 19th century novel whose original title was All's Well That Ends Well, which is, it's a bit of a cliched phrase, but the author changed the title to War and Peace and kept that. Pride and Prejudice was originally called First Impressions and was actually rejected as a manuscript with that title. And it was accepted when it was changed to Pride and Prejudice. So draw your own conclusions there. Certainly Pride and Prejudice is a far stronger title. The Kingdom by the Sea, sounds like a children's book, but actually it was the original title of Lolita. So not a children's book at all. So a title does mean a lot. Does anyone know what was originally going to be called He Do the Police in Different Voices? No? Terrible title. He Do the Police in Different Voices. It's actually a quote from a Dickens novel. Yes, The Wasteland, exactly. That's so The Wasteland is a much more powerful title. He Do the Police in Different Voices. I can't imagine that flying off the shelves, but I may be wrong. A couple of titles here for the same book. This author had lots of different titles, all of them rubbish, until he came on a stronger one. So a couple of the rubbish ones are The High Bouncing Lover. The High Bouncing Lover. I mean, that conjures up a lot of images, but not really anything relevant to the book that it was, I don't think. Another alternative for the same book was Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires. Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires. From those two terrible titles, can anyone?
The Great Gatsby.
Correct, The Great Gatsby, a much better title. And in fact, my cat is called Gatsby, so I can't imagine calling him the High Bouncing Lover. So yeah, The Great Gatsby. And also, where are we now? Yes, another one, rather dull title here, Something That Happened. Something That Happened. I mean, if you were trying hard, it would be very difficult to find a more boring title than Something That Happened. I'm not going to buy a book called Something That Happened. I may be very superficial, but I really don't think it would draw me. So luckily, the author changed the name of that to Of Mice and Men. Of Mice and Men, a much stronger title. So titles, I really do think titles matter, and those are just novels. So imagine the impact of a change of title of a poem, or well, we saw that with The Wasteland, or you know, any other piece of writing. Think carefully about your titles. You really want to draw in the reader. You want the reader to pick the book up. Okay. Okay, so I have 3 plots here, and I want suggestions for titles. A Viking goes on a pillaging trip to England. A Viking goes on a pillaging trip to England. Can anyone give me a reasonably good title? If you don't, I'll have to give one.
A Viking goes a Viking.
Ravaging, Moses says. Ravaging, yeah, great word, great word. Ravaging. Stranger Shores, yes, I like that too. That's very good, actually. Lockdown over. Yeah, yeah. The Sword of the Long Ship, excellent. Yeah, yeah. Reverse colony. Good, great. Some good suggestions coming in. I'll tell you what the author actually gave as a title. Everything ravaged, everything burned. So Moser, you weren't too far away. Everything ravaged, everything burned is the title of that. It's a short story by an American writer called Wells Tower. It's a great short story if you like Vikings and pillaging and stuff. But the Viking actually is a reluctant pillager. He'd far rather stay at home in Scandinavia and you know, sit on the deck with his wife watching the sun go down, but he has to go to work, and unfortunately his work involves raping and pillaging in England. So yeah, it's a great story actually. Another one, a family in the deep south of America encounters a group of criminals on the run. family in the deep south encounters a group of criminals on the run. Anyone got a good title for that? Hot Blood. Yeah, you're on fire, Moser. Hot Blood. It's good. Solidarity. Very good, Margaret. Yeah, I like that. Okay, I'll tell you the Band of Bells, very good. Sanctuary, yeah. Southern Comfort, very good. Very good, Susan. The actual title that the author uses for that story is A Good Man is Hard to Find. Great title, A Good Man is Hard to Find. It's by Flannery O'Connor. Again, it's a fabulous short story. Highly recommend it. Quite violent, but A Good Man is Hard to Find. And finally, of these, the story of a man whose ex-mistress has recently died. The story of a man whose ex-mistress has recently died. And obviously he has no one to talk to. He can't talk to his wife about it because she doesn't presumably know. The story of a man whose ex-mistress has recently died. Anyone think of a decent title for The X Factor? Moser, that's great. You should just be one of those title generators, Moser. You know, like we just ring you up and ask for a title. Catherine's very good at that too. Heart and Buttons, great stuff. Okay, so the title for this short story, this is actually a short story by a British writer called James Lasdon, and his title is It's Beginning to Hurt. It's Beginning to Hurt, which is a nice title that works on a number of levels if you read the story. It's a really short story. It's less than 2 pages. I recommend, again, it's one I often use in workshops because it's so concise, it's so compact. It's really well done. Okay, so those are a few ideas. I think I'm running out of not running out of time. I'm trying to race through, trying to get through all the information I have to you before, I don't know, before what? Before, I don't want to impinge on your open mic session. Okay, so I'm going to start talking faster and faster probably until it all becomes a kind of blur. So the first thing is, I said earlier that you can't really create a list for poetry titles in the way that you can for the scientific papers. But of course, I saw that as a challenge, so I have actually created a list. So this list is different types of titles. Okay, you might find this one quite useful. You might not. So one way of choosing a title is to choose a powerful image or a poetic image, giving it a sense of mood, time and place. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening, Robert Frost. Stopping by woods. So immediately we have a visual image there. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. It gives it's a lovely poetic phrase and line, and it takes us straight into a visual picture. We could probably all write a poem with that title. It's so evocative. It can almost set a train of thought going. And another one I like is Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota, which is one of my all-time favorite poems by James Wright. Lying in a hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. Again, we're transported to it. We're taken into the poem via this image, this sense of mood and time and place. Okay, so another sort of type of title is to use an archetype. Okay, so those of you who've read Jung might have a better idea than me of an archetype. I understand it really as a kind of prototype or a constantly recurring symbol that's kind of often present in a sort of collective unconscious. So the example I have here of an archetype title is The Raven. Okay, so The Raven, that's by Edgar Allan Poe. The raven as a bird, immediately we don't just see a bird. In that title, we see all sorts of other things because the raven has this symbolism. It gives us a shiver. It's dark. It's intelligent. It looks at us almost with its beady eye. There's a it kind of uses reuses the notion of an archetype. Okay, so the third type of title there that I came up with or through my trawlings on the internet is an emotional title, a title that tugs at the heartstrings, perhaps. Do not stand at my grave and weep is an example of that. Or Dylan Thomas's famous one, do not go gentle into that good night. You know, so you're using an emotional turn of phrase or a line or an idea to connect with the reader emotionally. Another type of title is one that raises a question. Okay, makes the poet, makes the reader think, and draws the reader in by that. An example I found was Ted Hughes' poem called Bride and Groom Lie Hidden for 3 days. Bride and groom lie hidden for 3 days. Now, that raises so many questions. What is this about? Are they alive? Are they dead? Why are they lying hidden? You can't help but want to read further. That's a title that raises a question. Another title like that is Maura Dooley's poem, What Every Woman Should Carry. What Every Woman Should Carry. Again, it's a title that makes you think. Firstly, you think, well, what is it? And then secondly, you think, well, what is the poem? You know, what am I going to find out in the poem? So a title that raises a question. The next one is I suppose, the Michael Longley one, the single word title. A single word can be risky. You have to get the right word, as we could see Longley did with Ceasefire. You have to choose, well, you don't have to, but choose a word that has more than one meaning, a word that itself has layers. Obviously, those layers have to be active in the poem itself too. Or you could choose a word that has a complex or even a polarizing meaning, like a complex meaning. For instance, Allen Ginsberg's poem, America. You know, what is America? It's vast, you know, so how can you write a poem just called America? You know, it's complex. So you have to look further. It draws you in. Sylvia Plath again, a poem like Daddy, immediately, you know, it draws you in. Paul Muldoon has a poem called History. History. Again, it's very open. And when you read the Muldoon poem, the history he's talking about, it's different kinds of histories. It's never quite what you think it's going to be. History, Paul Muldoon. So those are single word titles. There's many different forms of those. Each of these suggestions really has numerous different forms. Then there's the casual statement. Billy Collins, the American poet, is a master of these kind of casual statements as titles. For instance, Another Reason Why I Don't Keep a Gun in the House is the title of a Billy Collins poem. Of course you want to read on. Another Reason Why I Don't Keep a Gun in the House. Another one of his titles is simply Oh My God. Great title. I mean, it's just so simple, but I mean, you know, of course you want to read more. And another one is Looking for a Friend in a Crowd of Arriving Passengers. And Billy Collins has lots of those kind of titles, which are kind of seem to be throwaway, but can't help but draw you in as a reader. Another possibility is using a character's name, for instance, as your title. So Philip Larkin has a poem called Mr. Bleeny. Simple title, but it focuses the reader on where the story is, where the narrative is. Mr. Bleeny doesn't actually appear in the poem at all. Another poem like that would be T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Think of what the name might symbolize. Poets don't choose a name at random on the whole. So Mr. Bleeny, for instance, the Philip Larkin poem, Bleeny has a kind of rings with bleak, and he lives a bleak life, or he lived a bleak life in the poem. Bleeny, it's a dull sounding name. Okay, so if you're that's a character's name. Sorry, I went not too many more of these, I don't think. Place, use a place, for instance, as your title. Derek Mahan's wonderful poem, A Disused Shed in County Wexford, not only has a particular geographical place in Ireland, but also focuses down on a very specific part of that, a disused shed. So it's not just the name of a place, a county, it's also a disused shed. It's focusing on that place. He also has one, A Garage in County Cork, as well. That's a wonderful poem. He also has a poem called Antarctica. So yeah, so there's plenty of examples of poems that use place. And if you're using a place, the place has to resonate somehow with the content there. Humor, you can use you can put in a humorous title, quirky title. James Tate has a poem called The List of Famous Hats. The List of Famous Hats, quirky title. Paul Durkin is the absolute master of quirky titles. He has a title of a poem called My Beloved Compares Herself to a Pint of Stout. My beloved compares herself to a pint of stout. He also has a title on seeing two bus conductors kissing each other in the middle of the street. You know, if you like quirky titles, Paul Durkin is definitely the one to go for. And they can work really well. But of course, you've got to remember, if you've got a quirky title, the reader is expecting a quirky poem. So unless you completely deliberately upset those expectations, the reader may well be disappointed. So you need to get your title on the whole to match up with your poem. Some people leave the title right to the end of the poem. Some people, on the other hand, begin with the title. Quite often I've begun a poem just by having a title in mind. The inside of a ping pong ball, for instance. I still haven't written that, but one day I will. So you sometimes might have a title that nags at you, and you're just waiting for that moment to get the poem done. And then almost finally, of course, with a nod to the painters in the room, you might have a poem called Untitled, perhaps. Or alternatively, if you really are that stuck for a title, you might use the first line of the poem as the title, as the Dylan Thomas Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night does. And there's lots of other examples where the first line of a poem is it becomes the title. And then lastly, you'll be delighted to know that the final part of my list, the final thing on my list is, why not rape and pillage the works of Shakespeare or Yeats or Dickinson for a title? There's loads of great titles out there. You'd be amazed how many novels have come out with titles from Hamlet alone. There's literally hundreds have used a phrase from Hamlet, or like Time Out of Joint by Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, that comes from Hamlet. Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace's huge novel, comes from there. The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner I don't think that's from Hamlet, but it's certainly from Shakespeare. So, you know, Yeats' Things Fall Apart by Achebe is, you know, obviously comes from Yeats's poem. Emily Dickinson, I mentioned, her poem Hope is the Thing with Feathers. That was used or slightly adapted by Max Porter recently for his small book Grief is a Thing with Feathers. So that's the other thing. You can also change it slightly. You can adapt a famous phrase slightly for your own ends. So these are just some of my thoughts, some of the ideas of how to get around the problem of titling. I don't know if this is any help. If anything, it might have been muddying the waters, but hopefully there are some things there that you can use, some ideas. Titles are worth taking your time over. They can make the difference between Jane Austen being published and Jane Austen not being published. So a title is so important, I think. And as we saw with the Michael Longley poem, it can lift a piece onto another level. Okay, that's me. I've rushed through that last bit because I want to hear you all on the open mic. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening. And I really look forward to hearing some of your poems and try and put maybe some of those exercises develop into something yourselves. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. The open mic is being facilitated by Margaret O'Regan. So if you want to participate, please let her know in the chat.
So will we start the open mic now? Is that okay? Or does anyone have any questions for Matthew first? Yeah, we might as well start. The first person I have down here is Alexandra, because she's in Greece and there's a time difference. So Alexandra, if you want to go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you. It's almost midnight here, so okay.